Hello, everybody, and welcome to A Mighty Blaze. The blaze was sparked when COVID-19 extinguished the traditional in-person book tour. Our New York Times bestselling author co-founders Jenna Blum and Carolyn Levitt joined forces to promote books coming out and help those authors. Welcome to Lit Fic. I'm Bo Ellis, the Facebook director of The Blaze. I'm also a producer here. This week we have the amazing author Katherine A. Sherbrooke on. Katherine A. Sherbrooke is the author of Fill the Sky, which was a finalist for the May Sarton Award for Contemporary Fiction and the Forward Indies Book of the Year, and won a 2017 Independent Press Award, as well as Leaving Coy's Hill, also published by Pegasus Books. She is chair of the Grub Street Creative Writing Center in Boston, something A Mighty Blaze has very close ties to. We love Grub Street, and lives south of the city with her husband, 2 sons, and a black lab. And we also, as everybody knows, we love dogs and all animals and babies at the Mighty Blaze. So, Katherine, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me on, Bo. It's great to be here.
Yes, it's great to have you. How has your tour been going? I know you mentioned you were in LA last week.
Yeah, it's been great. So the book came out on April 4th, so kicked off in Boston at the Grub Street space, which was great, and had another event that week. And then, spent the week out last week in LA, since Aster Kelly, which we'll talk about, is sort of about 50% of it set in Hollywood. So did a bunch of events out there, which was really fun.
No, it's a really fun city, crazy traffic, but of course, it's worth it for all the other fun stuff that you get to say.
Exactly.
And normally I start off with asking about the book, but on your bio on your website, you had this really lovely story about how you wanted to be a writer, but felt like you didn't have some intangible gift that you thought you had to have, but then you learned that's not really what it's about. So could you speak a little bit about that journey and that realization?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So yes, from the time I was little, I always dreamed of being a writer because I sort of lived in books, and I found them quite magical and transporting. And so, I majored in English in college, like everything was books for me. But I honestly thought that writing was a talent that either you had or you didn't have. And if I had it, someone was going to come along, whether that be a professor or somebody, and literally sort of tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, you're one of us. Come behind the magic curtain. You should be in this world. I know that may sound crazy, but when that didn't really happen, I just sort of, I got a job in publishing, ended up on the business end, took a total left turn into an entrepreneurial career. And it wasn't until a little over 10 years ago, when I thought I was between startups, that I kind of took up the idea of writing again, and very much with Grub Street's help, understood that writing is a craft like any other craft. So if you want to be a great woodworker, you study with woodworkers who teach you how to sand and cut and, design, and that it's something that can be learned and something that can be practiced. And so I started learning and practicing, and 3 novels and 1 memoir later, I absolutely believe that it's something that, anyone who can put their mind to it and has a desire to write can, it's something that they can work on and get better at.
No, I really love that. I think that's such a really important lesson, because I do think it's really easy to think, especially with the way we're taught about writing, that everybody who is a writer had some magical innate gift that they just had the whole time, and they started off super great at writing. And maybe there's a few people out there who are like that. Good for them, I guess. I don't think most of us had that experience.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Most of us don't.
Yes. Most of us have to work pretty hard at it before we get to the point where we're actually like, oh, this is something I'm happy with and something I'm proud of.
Exactly. And there's a lot of talk about that first shitty draft, as it's called, which I resisted in the beginning, because I thought, like, why do I want to create something that's not good? Like, I didn't quite understand it. And it's the same idea that the first time you put anything down, it's unlikely not to need revision. It's likely to need a lot of revision, but that's okay. Like, you have to throw the clay down on the table before you have anything to work with to meld into something that looks beautiful. And so it was just a different way of thinking about it, of just, got to start somewhere and go from there.
Yeah, and that is, like I said, it's so important. And it's something I struggle with too, that first draft where it's like, its job is just to exist, not to be perfect.
Right.
So I feel like that's one of the hardest lessons to learn, though, because you're like, but I want it to be good. I want it to be good already.
Exactly. Exactly. Very hard.
Yeah. What was your first sort of genre you started with once you decided to start take up writing a little more seriously?
So my first book was a family memoir, and I took that on as a little bit more of a personal project. I just had a story. My parents have this great turbulent love story that I'd always wanted to capture. So I really saw it as a personal project. And that's what kind of clicked me into remembering this dream I'd have of always wanting to write. My first novel was contemporary fiction. And, for whatever reason, it fit into the story that I wanted to tell. And my two since have been historical fiction. So I've dabbled, I guess you could say, in a few genres.
Yeah, which I think it's always great to try a few out. And, no one has to be a one genre person. I think it's exciting to experiment a lot.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, but on to The Hidden Life of Aster Kelly, which I have right here, along with this really nice fancy book rack and this lovely ring that contains...
I have one too. We can talk about it.
Yeah, but I won't spoil it, but you should really read the book and figure out how this beautiful ring connects.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. There is... I usually don't talk about the covers because I know people don't always have input, but I think this cover is just so stunning and it's such a lovely model. Did you have any input with crafting this?
Yeah, thank you. I do love it. So my publisher's Pegasus Books, and they, in my opinion, just put out beautiful books. But they do ask for input. So I was able to provide what I'd call kind of a visual brief, kind of a whole slew of photographs or images, some of which were things I didn't want on the book. Others were things that I thought were evocative of the book. But I was honestly kind of all over the place. I was sort of like, hey, we could communicate 40s Hollywood with the font, or maybe there could be palm trees, or maybe there's a woman on the front, or. And they kind of managed to take about 80% of what I had suggested and put it all together in what, I think is really a stunning cover. So it's Face Out Studios is the name of the group that Pegasus hired to design this particular book. So I just love it.
No, it was one of the first things I noticed. I was like, that is an actually very stunning cover, from the font to that lovely model who's on it. She is so perfect, and that was kind of who I was picturing Aster as, just because I was like, I think she looks perfect for the role. So yeah, I love it.
Excellent, thank you.
Yes. So I read this was kind of based off a family secret of yours. So could you talk a little bit about that and how it sort of inspired you to write this book?
Yes. So Aster Kelly, of the title, for those listening, is a young woman who arrives in Los Angeles in 1948, eager to be a fashion designer. This is her dream when she arrives, which is a pretty bold dream for a woman in 1948. Very bold dream. And this isn't a spoiler. It happens very quickly in the first chapter. The man she goes to see, Fernando Tivoli, this up-and-comer designer with whom she's hoping to gain an apprenticeship, pretty quickly outs her as a runway model. And it turns out that she is trying to escape the world of being a runway model, but he needs her. As soon as he sees her, he feels like she's the missing piece for him in pitching a huge contract he wants to win with Galaxy Studios, a huge studio. So they kind of team up together, that she models for him and he agrees to apprentice her. And I tell you all that so the backstory will make sense. The inspiration came from the fact that my mother was a runway model in Hollywood in the 40s. But she would never talk about that time in her life. She was out there for several years. She came home divorced with a child, my oldest sister, by a lot of years. My sister's 18 years older than I am. And even though she had her first child out there, my mother would say that she preferred to pretend that that time in her life never existed, which was right intriguing and a little scary to me, like what happened there. But along the way, I would gather little tidbits. She would sort of let slip once in a while the kinds of people that she'd gotten to know while she was out there. And we're talking like Cary Grant, Bob Hope, Roy Rogers, Dale Evans level of famous people who it turns out she was quite, she was really in that orbit. So even more so than the fact that she had this kind of interactions with all these super famous people, but didn't want to talk about it. I'm like, I don't know about you. If that was me, I feel like that's all I would want to talk about. That made me more intrigued. And she, she's gone now. And unfortunately, we lost her memory to severe dementia many years even before we lost my mother. So it was always just this big mystery to me. So while I know some about her actual past there, this is a truly fictional story. But my own creative process, I guess, of answering the question of how does this gal from Newark, New Jersey end up hanging out with the likes of the Cary Grants of the world and come home so burdened by secrets. And so that was kind of my launch pad for just making up an interesting and I think hopefully unique story of what might have happened.
Yeah. It is amazing that your family has such a fascinating history to generate so many amazing ideas. That's very, very cool.
Yeah. Kind of like
it. I really loved also the way you showed that while this was a very glamorous world, particularly Hollywood in the 40s, that it was also a world that was very hard and had a lot of drawbacks. Like it's the discrimination against women and against LGBT people features heavily in the 1940s section. And I really respected that you showcase that and were not flinching away from the fact that that's how it was. Was that important to sort of really show that seedy, not exactly seedy underbelly, but that harsh reality of how it actually was then?
Yeah, definitely. So I think I'm always attracted to characters, strong characters who are kind of swimming upstream, if you will. They're the culture is telling them that they're supposed to be one way when they want to be another way. So whether that's from Aster wanting to be a fashion designer when everyone in the world just wants her to be a pretty woman, and have that be her career, or Fernando, who she becomes really dear friends with, who falls in love with an up and coming male star, like one of the new big hot stars, which in Hollywood was just an absolute non-starter. That belief that if the country ever found out that one of these stars was gay, then they would never watch another movie again. And they did everything they could to hide those kinds of relationships. I thought that was really important to show and to show, like, I'm really inspired by relationships that people in whatever it is, whether it's a career or relationship, who kind of stick to their guns and are determined to try and make it work against all odds. So that was definitely an important part of the story in my view.
And I think it adds, it's a very central part of the story. And it, I think, adds so much, especially to helping us understand who Aster is as a person by that strength of character she has, which I won't go too much into because you should absolutely read this book and find out what goes on with that. I was also wondering, Aster's a little based off your mother. Is she based off her a lot in terms of personality, or is it just the idea of your mother being out there was the jumping off point and Aster's kind of her own person.
Yeah, she's her own person. I mean, there are a few things like my mother made all her own clothes because she couldn't afford the kinds of clothes she modeled. And so that's sort of where the nugget of wanting to be a fashion designer came from. So there's some characteristics. Some of Aster's backstory is similar to my mother's, actually, her difficult relationship with her own mother. But Aster's definitely her own person. I wanted to be able to free myself from who my mother was. And by the way, I didn't know, I don't know that much about what my mother was really thinking and feeling when she was 20 years old. And I wanted to free myself to give Aster the agency to kind of try on new things. She's sort of even exploring her sexuality when she gets out there in terms of, is this like, can I be taken seriously and also be feminine and flirt with this guy who's interested in me? Like, can I be both those people at the same time? All those kinds of things that any young person, tends to think about and maybe experiment with. And so I wanted to really free myself to be able to develop Aster in the way that kind of Aster wanted to be developed.
Yeah. And I think she is an absolutely amazing character.
Thank you.
The book, it's kind of divided into two characters with Lissy. Is it pronounced Lissy?
Lissy, yes.
Okay, perfect. And she is in 1970s in the New York Broadway scene. So what made you decide to set the last half of the book in 70s Broadway?
Yeah. So the 70s in Broadway was a really important time for Broadway. So we all, the 40s in Hollywood is pretty regularly considered like the golden age. But when you think about the 70s, it was really a resurgence of Broadway, and Broadway getting back on the map in a really big way. Some super important shows. You think about Stephen Sondheim as an example. He starts being really active in the 70s. But again, just like how you mentioned that Hollywood looks really glamorous, but there's this dark underbelly. New York at that time, inside the theater was really different than outside the theater. Times Square was a super scary place to be. And I grew up pretty close to New York and would go to Broadway shows, and it was terrifying as a young girl, like walking through. So I liked that that parallel to Aster's life. And this book has a lot of artists in it when you think about it, whether fashion designers or actors or singers, sculptors. It's very much about the artistic journey. And so I wanted to place Lissy in a very different industry than her mother, but one where she is also trying to find her artistic voice as a young person and her place in the world as a young person, and all that, the insecurity and lack of confidence that can come with, do I deserve to be here? Should I be trying out to be on Broadway? Will I ever make it? All of those insecurities I find really interesting and go through them regularly as a writer. So I thought that was interesting. And then also the both exciting and debilitating things that fame can do, which obviously is part of the Hollywood story. But same thing, Lissy has to ask herself, am I chasing fame by wanting to be on Broadway? Is it an obligation I feel to uphold some acting legacy? What is it? So I like that the two timelines mirror each other in some ways.
No, I really love that kind of dichotomy between Aster and Lissy, where Aster was really like trying to get out of the spotlight where she would be the focus, whereas Lissy's trying to get really hard to get into that spotlight. She wants to star on Broadway. She wants to be the one people are looking at and kind of grappling with that. So I found that a really fascinating parallel current between the two of them and how it shows.
Yeah, I'm glad that you say that. And their relationship, I think, is interesting. When you know somebody well, we sometimes, though, assume that they want the same things that we want, or that they see the same situation in the same way that we do. And so I was fascinated by sort of the mother-daughter story of how, just as you're saying, one wants to be in the spotlight, one wants to get out. and even how, Lissy views her childhood versus how her mother Aster views Lissy's childhood. They see it really differently. But you're not always aware of that, even when you're living in the same house. So
yeah, I always find mother-daughter stories and family stories like that so compelling, because when you see both points of view, where it's like, well, that's not how I remember your childhood, and it's like, well, it's what I experienced, is always a fascinating tension to explore.
Yes. Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. And it's not something that many people even get a chance to discuss with their parents. So it's always interesting to read about.
Right. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
And also, this is kind of a silly question, but I really loved your characters' names. How did you come up with these really fun, interesting names?
That's interesting. Gosh, naming characters is so hard. It is like naming children, and there's so much that comes along with the name. And interestingly, this book itself talks a lot about names, like people changing their names, people sometimes being forced to change their names, a consideration of what does this name mean that I've been given, the last name you're born with to a name you might take if you marry. I'm sort of fascinated by all of that. But that said, so Aster Kelly, I knew I needed to come up with a name that sort of sounded glamorous. And so it was sort of a mishmash of, whether you take Grace Kelly or Jean Kelly, and Aster meaning star and that sort of thing. And the other ones, I don't know. I tend to rename my characters a lot until I find a name that really fits. The one I knew from the get-go was Fernando. Fernando Tivoli. I knew he was going to be Italian, and that just, I don't know, popped into my head. Christopher Page, I thought was a good name for a star. He's Fernando's love interest.
Yes.
And yeah, I guess it's not a very good scientific answer, but I just play around with names a lot until I'm like, oh yes, that sticks. That one sticks.
I do feel like a not as often discussed side of writing is how hard it is to pick names. And although I know some people where they're like, I just pick the first one that comes to mind and I don't think it's a big deal. And then there are people like you and I who maybe agonize over it a lot more than that.
Right. Yeah. It feels like a big opportunity, that's sort of wasted if it doesn't feel good. It has to feel good all the time. So I'll often have a character who has a name for a month, and then I'll be like, no, I'm not liking it. So.
And I think readers will always kind of dig into what does this name mean? So I also keep conscious of that, where it's like, I don't want to accidentally imply some weird thing with a character's name and have some reader be like, what does this mean? And then I have 0 answers.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Did you do a lot of research to sort of establish these timelines? Because Hollywood in the 1940s, and you mentioned that you were really near to New York maybe in the 70s, but did you do a lot of research to make sure you were bringing them to life accurately?
Yeah, I do tend to do a lot of research, and in everything from what's actually going on at the time that I'm writing the book, but also just sort of visually. So this book, takes you behind the scenes of a sound stage in Hollywood. It takes you backstage to a Broadway show. I really like books that take you somewhere you might not have access to normally. So I rely on things like memoirs and documentaries and vintage photographs, vintage magazines that not only will talk about the era or the place, but will, bring the visuals to it. Because that, to me, then I can picture it, and then I can write about it. So I did a lot of that. And then there's obviously a lot of fashion in this book, because Aster is a runway model and Fernando is a designer. And so I'm looking over here because I have these like stacks of fashion resource books, like literally books about textiles and different cuts of different gowns and different fasteners and all these things. That's like way more information than I would need for the book, but when I need the exact detail, it was great to be able to call up something like that and then know I was putting in something that was authentic.
Yeah, and it definitely felt authentic when I was reading it, and those little details would come up. I was like, wow, that's, because I don't know a lot about textiles or fashion design, but it was really fascinating to read about it when it came up. And I was like, oh, I never thought about how much thought goes into it.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, that's always a fun part of it.
Mhm. Aside from seeing a lot of Broadway shows, were you ever involved in the theater as like an actor or writer behind the scenes running around?
I was involved in theater as a kid. I really loved being sort of part of a cast
Mhm.
and acting. I don't have much of a voice though, and you get to a certain age in school, they tend to all do musicals, and like unless you've got the great voice, then you don't seem to get the parts, and so that sort of fell away. But I did attend Broadway, as I mentioned, starting from being a very young child, and it was always just one of my absolute favorite outings.
Mhm.
So I've always loved it. And I did dabble with some playwriting actually in college also. That's sort of where I started as a writer.
Mhm.
And so I think I always lean towards dialogue in a lot of ways, because that's kind of all you've got when you're writing a play or a screenplay. And so I tend to have a lot of dialogue also in my books.
Yeah, I did notice that and how natural and free flowing your dialogue felt, where
Oh, thank you.
sometimes, yeah, sometimes in novels, dialogue might sound a little clunky because we aren't thinking of how it's spoken. So
Right.
that tracks to me because you had a lot of very beautiful dialogue in this
Oh,
book.
thank you. That's great. Yeah. And you do have to read it out loud, sort of as you were
Mhm.
saying, and also think a lot about how people talk to each other. One of the things I think about a lot is that when someone asks a question, people rarely just answer the question, in a conversation. So
True.
often
Yeah.
one person saying this and the other person saying this, and it rarely tracks entirely linearly. So I think about that a lot too.
Hmm. And I think that leads your characters to go in really interesting places with their conversations in that
Hmm.
natural way that we all do, where we're always a little more scattered while talking than maybe we always realize.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely true.
Yeah. Another question is, your last two books have been historical fiction, but you've also written memoir and contemporary fiction. Do you have a genre you prefer writing in, or are you just go wherever your kind of muse takes you?
Yeah, I would say I go where my muse takes me. I do like, as I said, being being able to have something about the book that takes the reader somewhere they may not have otherwise been. So even my first novel, which was contemporary fiction, took
Mhm.
place entirely in a mountain village in Ecuador and had a lot of rituals from South American shaman. Because to me, that was super interesting setting and set of
Mhm.
experiences. So even though it was modern day, you're still somewhere different, because I guess I really do like evocative details. Um, and and then, the character just happens to be in that place or time, but I think that
Mhm.
helps make it a little more interesting. And for me, I guess I really enjoy sort of painting the overall scene. I'm not sure I'd be as good at. I'm always amazed when writers can hold your rapt attention and the characters are just sitting in a kitchen that looks like any other kitchen, like that's a really amazing skill. And to carry off a whole novel like that is like, that's amazing to me. I think for me, it's like, well, at least make a beautiful setting to start and then dive into the story.
Yeah, I mean, I personally found just the characters and plot were fascinating enough for me, although I loved the setting too, and I loved feeling like I was exploring and learning about these places that, of course, I've never been to Hollywood in the 1940s, so it's
Yeah.
lovely to feel like you're on a little trip there, but
Yeah.
I also definitely found these characters very compelling. I'm also a theater person. We kind of discussed that before. I work in theater as my primary job, so I always love reading about the theater. Maybe that's that narcissism of theater people, but it's very exciting.
Yeah. No, that's great. I don't feel like there's a lot of, I haven't read a lot of fiction with characters who are in the theater, I feel like. I mean, sure, Hollywood, but like the stage isn't quite as common. So that was fun.
No, I absolutely agree with you on that, where I feel like when we think of acting, we think of always the people on screen and on our TVs who are amazing and awesome, and we love them. But there's also the amazing, awesome people who are on a live stage doing the shows every night, who that's also a very fascinating and uniquely terrifying experience.
Yeah, quite different. You know, it's often a different set of skills. Yeah, high intensity, right? Even higher stress, because you can't take a second take.
Yes, which is why I loved reading about Lissy and her sort of experience with going through auditions, which are so harrowing, and
right.
And then living that life.
The starving artist. That constantly being judged, the split-second decisions that are made in auditions. It's just a really challenging life, and takes a lot of courage to continue to pursue that. So as I had mentioned, I liked thinking about, the courage it takes to do that, and Lissy's very determined, but of course then she comes home after not getting a call back and thinks, what am I doing? This is ridiculous. I'm never going to make it. So,
and I think that's a pain a lot of creative people go through, because when you submit something for your writing and they're like, no thanks, you're always like, oh man. What do I do from here?
Exactly. So, there's a lot of me in Lissy, that's for sure.
Yes. So one question from the audience, can you talk about what you're working on right now, or is that a little more hush-hush, or are you not even sure what you're working on right now?
It's a little early to talk about it in specific, but I have this idea I've been pondering for some time, and so I say I'm in kind of like the percolating phase right now of really trying to get my head around these characters and kind of where they're going to go from this starting point that I've developed for them. So I do a lot of writing in my head, kind of the walking around kind of writing, or while I'm in the shower or walking the dog. And I'm looking forward to then starting to bring it to life on the page very soon.
Nice. That is always, it's a fun and scary stage when you're really just learning about what you're even writing next.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like terrifying every single time.
Yes.
Until I really get to know the characters, and then they really become whole, and they almost exist on their own, in this space outside my head, it feels like. So it's a little bit of it's like, I always think of it like the divining rod in Harry Potter, like just waiting till it's something I can pull all the way out of my head and make real. So it's a crazy process.
Yeah. And for another audience question, what surprised you most about this book?
Surprised me the most? Well, I will say that there are a couple of plot twists, one big one, and I have no idea where it came from. Really. I mean, I really don't, which is kind of fascinating to me through the whole artistic process. So these characters, I feel like more than in any of my previous books, really demanded their own directions at a certain point. And I've heard writers say that before, like before I started writing, and I was like, really? Like, I don't get that. But I really felt that way, that several of these characters just kind of, they decided what they needed, and then I was like, oh, okay, all right, I guess that's what we'll have to do.
Yeah, it is something that before you start writing, you're like, that kind of sounds like just something people say to make it seem more special or something, but then you realize, oh, that actually happens.
Yeah, that actually happens. Yeah. So it's always fun discoveries when it does, actually.
Yes. And so we're winding down to the end of this interview now, but I always like to ask this. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? If I missed anything you really wanted to discuss today, I always like to.
Well, the one thing I would say that might be fun for the audience to know is that there are two original songs that have been written to go with this book. The 1970s timeline music is really important, both because Lissy's in a musical and her love interest is a singer-songwriter. And so I've collaborated with a fabulous musician from the Berklee College of Music who wrote two original songs. All she had was the title of the two songs in the book. She read the book and loved it, and she recorded them and dropped them on the same day that the book published. So they're now streaming wherever you get your music. Her name is Madigan Linane, but if you go to the contact page on my website, and I think you dropped a link to the website in here.
I did.
kasherbrooke.com. If you go to the contact page, the first thing there tells you where you can go listen to the music if you're interested. So that was super fun. And the songs are going to be on the audiobook, which is a little delayed, but it will be coming out in June. So that's just another extra layer to the book. That's super fun.
No, that is an amazing little cross media experience. And that's so cool to bring that music to life like that.
Right? I mean, since it's about performers, I thought, let's see if we can make it real. And Madigan just did a beautiful job writing and recording these songs. So hope people will check them out.
Yes, you absolutely should. And you absolutely should check out The Hidden Life of Aster Kelly. I actually cannot recommend it enough. As somebody, like I said, who loves theater, this is a book that is amazing. If you have any interest in theater or just are interested in very compelling stories, I absolutely remember checking it out. And I'm also going to go listen to those songs because that's really cool.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. What are you doing next and where can people follow you?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter as Kazeze. You have it there. I'm also on Facebook, and I have a bunch more events coming up. If there are any New Yorkers listening, I'll be at the Drama Bookshop, which is Lin-Manuel Miranda's store, on April 25th, which is super exciting. I'll be at Wellesley Books April 27th with Jane Roper. Again, my website, on the events page of it, I try to keep my events really up to date. So I have a bunch coming up actually now through the end of spring and into summer even. So depending where you're located, if you see one near you, please come say hi. Yes,
absolutely. Say hi. Absolutely buy this book. And thank you to everybody watching. And thank you so much for joining us on Lit Fic this week. Katherine, you were amazing to talk to, and you wrote an amazing book, The Hidden Life of Aster Kelly, which I'll show you again one last time. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe for more blazing goodness and more amazing authors like Katherine A. Sherbrooke, and we will see you all around.
Thank you so much, Bo. Thanks, everyone, for listening.